Okay, hello everybody, good morning. It's wonderful just to be here and be able to do this again because this is the part 3 of the tours that we've been doing already, and now we're going to do everything below Beaver Street, and I'm going to tell you about what I remember down here, how things have changed a lot, and the changes happened, in the course of my 80 years of being on the streets of Lower Manhattan. So it's quite something for me to go back in all of this and so on and see how much has happened. But I worked downtown between 1956 onward as a messenger, going through many of these different streets and places, and some of those streets are not there anymore. I actually remember a ferry terminal prior to this one here, but the terminal that we're in now, that you can enjoy and look at with all the light and air here, this was opened in 2005. So it's a multi-modal facility, with all the bells and whistles of elevators, escalators and things, and the original terminals and still designed for vehicles on the first level and for the pedestrians on the upper level. So we're going to go outside and take a look at what was here originally. This way. Okay, folks. What you're looking at over there, those 3 bays of terminal from 1909, they start building in 1905-6. Well, that was what was here originally too. Okay, there was a set of 3 there and 3 here. Yeah, the Battery Marine building that you see, the 3 bays there for the ferry slips, was the same kind of building that used to be here, where we have this new modern terminal that was built, lovely 1909 Beaux-Arts building with beautiful tile work, iron work, and I think you can even see some probably Guastavino tile there on the balcony. And it was all renovated now as an entertainment, I think, in a hotel space, besides getting your ferry to Governor's Island there. And what happened is the ferry terminal would decline by the 1950s. They would build a new one. And the new terminal, by the 1990s, had a fire in it. And the roof collapsed and everything. So they really had troubles. And this new one wasn't open till 2005. So it's kind of the 3rd iteration of the terminal that you see over there. How things can change in a century from the original to what we have now, which is a wonderful confluence of public transportation, because you have your boat subway lines coming here. You have taxis coming up this way. You have the bus station over on the other side. And so it's everything together to get people going when you're coming in or out of the ferry. It's a beautiful terminal because it allows a lot of light and air coming into it. You can go up on the deck there outside and you get beautiful views of the harbor. I would take tourists who haven't had a chance to go on the Staten Island ferry up there for the harbor view. You can even have a view of the Statue of Liberty from the 2nd deck of the terminal. Anyway, you know how Water Street is very wide. It's a wide street, but it was a narrow street originally, just like Pearl Street and Front Street and so on. And that was widened in the 1950s because of this new terminal and all the new office towers coming up downtown after the Second World War. And where you see the corner building over here that I'm pointing to, that was the Army Induction Center. So maybe your grandparents or so on, if they were inducted into the Army like I was in the 1960s, you would go there. And the building had an interior courtyard with offices and such all around it. And I remember just feeling like I was inside of a fortress, because it was very much a very dominant building right here on the corner. And it had ironwork with military designs around the base of it and kind of like a moat around it even. There was a distance of a few feet before you entered it, and it was kind of very intimidating. And I remember because I was inducted twice. The first time I was inducted, I have allergies, so they didn't take me then. But with the Vietnam War accelerating, a couple of years later, they called me back again before they gave me a deferment. So that's kind of probably saved my life, my allergies and such. So this building very much impressed me, and it kind of terrorized me because of this confining business inside. It had a shaftway right through it, and actually that building is still there. Inside the new exterior that was put on in the 1980s when it became the New York Health and Racquet Club. It was maybe the skeletal construction that was saved of the building to reclad it and make it a modern building. Now, if you look over the entrance to the basement on the right side of the Mother Seton Shrine, the Mission of Our Lady of Rosary, over the entrance to that basement, there is a Celtic cross. That was St. Bridget's Chapel down there, a place where the Irish immigrant girls would stay and get some help in starting their new life in America. They put up the chapel to Mother Elizabeth Bailey Seton because she was the founder of the Sisters of Charity, and she was being put up for sainthood. That was 1965, and it was actually on the site of the wonderful row house mansion that she lived in. So that's kind of like a continuation of her life in a way. And she was made a saint in the Roman Catholic Church in 1975. But before that, next to it, the building that is there with the columns and the porch was a complex of the old Watson Mansion from the late 1790s to the early 1800s, one of the wealthy merchants that would live right there on the water. That was the shoreline of New York State Street. So the waterline was the view looking out over the harbor. So that was a mansion that was saved by the Catholic Church in the 1880s and became the Mission of Our Lady of the Rosary. And they did have a chapel in there before the chapel next to it would be built in 1965. And the one next to it was the German Catholic organization, the Leo House, named after Pope Leo, for the German Catholics to have their social services and a place to stay when the Irish and the Germans were actually the first great immigrant settlers downtown here in this area. So, and then would come the people from the Middle East and the people later on from the Slavic countries. That would be torn down, and in the 1920s, it would be opened up on 23rd Street between 8th and 9th Avenue. The Leo House is still there. But if you look at the style of architecture of the church, you'll think it's back from the days of the Federal style when they were building buildings like that. They're very sympathetic to the style of the mansion, so you can't even tell sometimes if it's just a revival of it. So that's a revival. But they were originally all beautiful townhouses on the curve of State Street here, the original shoreline. Think of Washington Square North and those style of houses. That's what was on State Street. And actually, I remember what was on that site. There was a 5-story white brick tenement that was on that site. And before that was the fancy row house that the Seton family had lived in. An interesting thing, I knew a family that lived in that tenement on the site of the 1965 chapel. So there were immigrants living all through this area as well, too. Okay, now I want you to notice, you see the curve of the sidewalk here? It goes around. This was a street. This was Battery Place that came right in front of the Custom House until the 1970s when they were redoing the subway station at Bowling Green. It's not the beautiful old Hines and Lafarge tile that used to be here. You can see the Hines and Lafarge wonderful head house entrance on the corner of Battery Park. So this was a subway station from 1905 that by the 1970s they would modernize. They would close off this Battery Place here that came right here up to Whitehall Street and make it a plaza and make another entrance here for the Bowling Green complex underneath. So it's this garish looking red tile rather than the nice beautiful old ceramic tile that used to be here in 1905. But, you know, this was not a landmark station or anything that should have been. And the Custom House, I remember way back when, before it became the Museum of the Native American, it was abandoned. It was left empty for a couple of decades before the museum took it over, and the interior is magnificent. Great building by Cass Gilbert, the noted architect who did many, many great things in New York and around the country, including the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. What I want to do is talk about the big, humongous building. Look at the big building behind you. Okay, it goes all the way around from that street up here to Beaver Street and all the way back into an alleyway that we will see in a little while. The building that was on the site was one of the most beautiful commercial buildings I've ever seen. Has anybody been to the Architecture Museum in Washington, D.C., the former Pension House building? Beautiful with all the terracotta and brickwork, a humongous building that looked like this that was on the site, okay? It was a very large building built in the 1880s as the produce exchange for the commodities and things. The building was designed by George B. Post, the same noted architect who would do the Brooklyn Historical Society, that same kind of red brick and terracotta building, and also he had done the World newspaper building up by the Civic Center. So George B. Post is a great architect working with terracotta and brick and making a beautiful arrangement with columns and such. There was a clock tower on the building, a four-sided clock. But what was very impressive was the interior. If you know the main concourse in Grand Central Terminal, what was of that dimension, not as long, but even a little bit wider in a way. It was a large trading floor that could accommodate 3,000 business people that did all this commodities trading. There was something like 2,000 windows, 1,000 doors in it. I mean, it was an incredible piece of construction at the time. It had an atrium in the center. The trading floor was on the second floor before you had, gas lamps and such rather than electric light. These big buildings had like a courtyard for the upper floors, and then they have a skylight over the lower floors that allow the light to come in. Torn down by 1957, and then they would build this building on its site, number 2 Broadway, as an office building. The building is on the footprint of that produce exchange. One architectural critic said one of the best buildings in New York was torn down for one of the worst buildings, because it's another one of those ubiquitous glass and steel skyscrapers that was built after the Second World War when the financial district was coming back, okay? The redeeming thing about this building is that it has probably the largest outdoor mosaic mural artwork on it. It's Lee Krasner's work, which is incredible, but it's probably the largest public mural that you don't have to go into a museum or something to see as far as decoration. And there is another part of her mural work on the other side. You can see the Broad Street entrance to 2 Broadway from this side. I worked in that building for a brokerage firm, so that was the irony of it, I worked on the site of where I saw that beautiful big building being torn down, and I didn't believe at that time as a young fellow, 16, 17 years old, that buildings like that wouldn't last forever. We're going to turn into what looks like an alleyway, and we're going to wind up on the street that was cut off to build that produce exchange. Let's go around the corner. Can't do this without everybody cooperating with me. I used to be all the one-man show, How many people have never been down this street? Yeah. You think this is the back alleyway when you're on the other street on Broad Street. And then when you're looking down this way, you think, oh, that's nothing but a little entranceway to this humongous office building. So the produce exchange, when it would be built here in the 1880s, would close off what's now Marketfield Street. And that would lead to where the market was held in the days of the Dutch, by where the fort was, which is where the custom house is now, where we were before. So this street went all the way through to Whitehall Street originally. But when in the 1880s they were building that humongous produce exchange, but it did have that full site all the way from Beaver down to the next 2 blocks. All right, we're going to walk down to Broad Street. This is the back of the buildings on Beaver. You go first. As my bad fifth grade joke said, the haunted house, why you go first. They do film shootings down here sometime because it's a block that has an old atmosphere and it doesn't have traffic. Another impressive building that I had seen in my walks was the International Telephone and Telegraph building on the corner of Beaver Street and Broad Street. It had this corner entrance with this dome over the entrance. It looked like you were going into a cathedral. The beautiful mosaics there showed the eastern and western hemispheres, the globes, and kind of an angel holding on to them. And then all signs of electricity and such that would be transmitting all the information all over the world, which was the symbol for the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation. In a late 1920s building and in the Art Deco style. So I was impressed by it. I really didn't know the story of it, but there was a piece of beautiful private artwork in the public eye. And you know that the names of streets tell you about the history of who they are, right? Stone Street was the first paved street in New York in the 1650s. This is where all the wealthy people used to live. Well, in the 1980s, they were building this tremendous building here. They closed off Stone Street and actually kept the shape of Stone Street through the lobby as it turned a bit. And we're going to come out on the other side of it, all right? But also, after that, the Landmarks Commission would then take the Dutch street patterns that were still here and make them an official New York City landmark, so they don't close off a lot of these older streets like Pearl Street or Beaver Street or so on. When they were designing the building, they had to give a public plaza and such because they're taking away public amenity by closing the street. Well, they also have the plaque here of what the old Dutch New Amsterdam looked like around 1660. You can see where the fort is where the custom house is today, and then up Broad Street was the canal. Okay, and this is the waterfront, and this is Whitehall Street over here. So we're going around and we're going to see this same medallion on the other side. And you can see how the street turned as the lobby turns now too. When they were doing the building, they were finding the architectural remains of the old 1600s buildings that were here. And you can still see the foundation of those buildings here because this is all part of that history that had to be saved now. They got this kind of like an outdoor museum to give you an idea of what it looked like. And where you see over here the brick markings in yellow, that was the site of the first Dutch city hall, the Stadthaus. Because this is the shoreline originally. Pearl Street here was the shoreline. And you know, the city hall we have from 1811, talk about layers of history, okay? That's the fourth city hall of New York. Because after the Stadthaus wasn't used, they used Governor Lovelace's Tavern, which was right next door. And then after that, it was Federal Hall. That was the city hall before it became Federal Hall and was used for the inauguration of George Washington until the city hall was built way to the north in what's City Hall Park now. So that's our fourth city hall. And actually we have the oldest continuously used city hall in the United States. So celebrating our 400th anniversary of New York, you know, we're layers of history. But this article in the newspaper from the early 2000s shows a lot of Pearl Street further up, even above Wall, around Maiden Lane and John Street. There's a whole series of red brick 4- or 5-story buildings. They were commercial buildings. They would be turned into tenements. They were originally townhouses, some of them. And one of them was, you know, Colgate, the great corporation, toothpaste and on, you know, pharmaceuticals. Colgate got started in one of these buildings. There's only the facade of one of the buildings that was the Colgate original building that's still left. There's all new development up there. with large office and residential towers on those sites. But these are the streets that I remember that looked like this, all the way up through the South Street Seaport. We lost about 2/3 of what's left of the South Street Seaport back in the 1950s when they were widening Water Street. All the way from Whitehall up to Wall Street, the whole eastern side, all the buildings that were there were totally demolished for the large office towers, and there was a lot of expansion downtown in the 1960s and 70s, and a lot of those office towers would replace all of these red brick buildings, of which you are going to see the couple of streets that were remaining over here when we go up the other side of Stone Street, which was interrupted by this 1980s office tower. So we were talking about people living downtown around the perimeter. Well, you can see there's a couple of old tenements still over here existing on Pearl Street, okay, from the mid-19th century. Actually, the elevated train used to run by up on Pearl Street originally. Okay, this was the back alley, really, the street of the buildings that fronted on Pearl Street or on the other side on South William Street. And then there's a little lane that goes in between Mill Lane, because in the Dutch days there was a mill over here, and this was where the first Jewish settlement lived in a bad part of town at that time. Stone Street, over where we had passed by the fort, was the very high-end residential street. You can see a kind of Dutch revival. These buildings were done after the 1835 fire. That was put on in the early 1900s by the owner of the building by having kind of a Dutch-style townhouse effect. We're going to continue all the way up into Hanover Square, and we're going to end the tour there.
You have specific memories about this brownstone?
It was the Cotton Exchange.
This is the Cotton Exchange. It was various things. I think it's like a private club now.
Yes.
Yeah, a restaurant there.
Yeah, and there's Harry.
The Hanover House, yeah. All right, you noticed all the markings along the way here. This was all done as a memorial to all the people from the British Empire or former British Empire that lost their lives in 9/11. So they made this into a little park memorial to memorialize them, and you'll see the names of different places and countries or whatever outlined throughout this new plaza. This was not here. That was Stone Street that we had just walked up, that continued all the way on up here to Pearl Street. This was done probably in the 1950s, 60s or so on. So I think that's it, kind of, folks. I kind of pointed out what used to be in places, a couple of great buildings that we lost, the changes that, I've seen in just, like I said, the 80-some years of walking these streets. It's kind of like a wake-up call in the lifetime of a person, what can change and what we think we know or is going to be permanent. We're celebrating the 400th anniversary of the city of New York. Okay, I've been walking these streets for over 80 years. So I've actually experienced 20% of the history of New York in my lifetime and seen that. Kind of like walking history, and I'm a storyteller. So I want everybody to understand how things change and to think about what we should keep, what we should do to make things better for everybody as we go along, saving the best of the old for the new. As advocates, understand what the environment is and think about what we should save or incorporate for the future. So I want to thank you all for coming on my tour today. Everybody have wonderful holidays, okay? Okay. Okay. And I think all of this is kind of a wake-up call for me of what can happen. I mean, there's nothing that's going to stay forever if it's not protected. I got to understand more about how art and architecture are combined and how architecture can be very artful. So this is a lesson, I think, in our daily life to just look around and see what we can see and enjoy what's there. And I'm happy to remember all that.